This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Zia and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at patreon.com/Dig Me Out. And Jay, thanks to our steering committee and board of directors at Patreon, we were able to lock down a topic for this episode. It took us a while to actually get the gang together and record this one, so it's about a week late as far as posting. We didn't make our March deadline, but we will make this happen. We are making this happen. It's happening right now as I'm speaking.
And this is a bit of a sleeper, I think, way to take this. I don't think we would have thought of this ourselves. So
no, this was brought up by the patrons.
Yeah, so thank you. Good idea.
It was New Order versus Bruce Springsteen in the 90s. Mm-hmm. That was the battle that took place on our poll. New Order, I think it was 4-1 was the percentage, or not percentage, but the vote difference. So it was by a bit of a landslide that we're doing New Order in the 90s. And this is going to be interesting because there isn't a whole lot of New Order in the 90s. So this is going to be like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
No, not really.
When I saw that we were doing this, I was like, oh, okay, I have to dig more into the catalog. And I'm going through, I'm like, where are all the records at? And you had to explain to me.
Yeah, I'd explain.
I'm a noob.
No, you're going to have 12 other albums that aren't New Order to listen to.
Right.
One which we've already done, which we'll get into later. But to help us run the decade of New Order and their various side projects, we have a couple of returning guests. I believe the last time Mr. Matt Shivadecker joined us was Electronica in the 90s. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That was
glad to be back.
That was a fun episode. We expanded our horizons on that episode. We're more on the rock end of things, so that was fun to get into that end of the 90s with you and our roundtable. And of course, been here many times before. Fresh off her Rock and Roll Hall of Fame tweet storming, Annie Zaleski, welcome back.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about New Order in the 90s. And this is, as we mentioned in the lead-up, a band that didn't put out a lot of material in the 90s. They actually put out one album of original material, and then they put out a greatest hits, and then a second remix hits release because they kind of broke up for a lot of the 90s, but they did put out a lot of side project material. So we're going to get into that. We're going to start with 1989, though. This is not Dig Me Out 80s. This is Dig Me Out 90s, but we're going to start with 1989 because that's the last album that the band makes on Factory Records. So it's a big deal. It's also their first album to reach number 1 on the UK albums chart, which I found that kind of strange. I figured that they might have had an album before that. And I'm talking about Technique, which was released in January of 1989. It had 2 top 20 singles in the UK and the US, which were Fine Time and Round and Round. So, Jay, I'm going to start with you. What's your familiarity with New Order in terms of the 80s stuff versus 90s stuff? I know you know some of the 2000s stuff, but had you listened to much of the 90s stuff or 80s stuff?
No, it wasn't really until the 2000s, I think. Siren's Call, I liked that record a lot. And the one before that, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it came out in maybe 2000.
Get Ready.
Yeah. That kind of introduced me, like, I mean, obviously I was aware of the band, but I hadn't spent a ton of time listening other than hearing some of the singles here and there. But that's when I really started to get into the band and understand them, from that point forward.
Okay.
Really where I started.
So, Shiv, let me ask you about Technique. I went back and revisited this record, and I was shocked because I didn't really know the singles from this album. I'm more familiar with, like, Age of Consent and Bizarre Love Triangle and some of those.
Sure.
But this is a high charting album. It's a number one. Where do you place this in terms of overall album, in terms of their output in the 80s? Would you consider this one of their top records, or is this a matter of they had built up such a run of records that they squeaked this one out at the end with a number one?
Well, sure. I mean, I do think that that's part of it. Is just that at that point, they were very well known, and they had a lot of big hits, and so I think that the success of the record can be attributed a lot to those factors. But I mean, I even though I don't love that album entirely, I mean, I think Fine Time is one of the best singles. And I actually was just kind of preparing for this podcast. I was pulling vinyl off my shelves, and I do have a Fine Time 12-inch, which is just it's got some incredible remixes on it. And so really that record came out right around the time I actually, I started listening to WOXY, where I ended up working for many, many years. But I was probably the end of my junior high years there in 1989, heading into high school when I first started listening to the station. And so I was definitely exposed to the singles from this record from listening to the radio. Okay.
Now, Annie, when do you enter the picture with New Order? I think you're a few years younger than the rest of us, because we all went to college together. Was it towards the end of the 90s or end of the 80s with New Order, or did you catch up with them in the 90s?
So the big one I actually remember was Regret, I think. So I was definitely probably early 90s.
Okay.
Like that, I loved that song. That was one of I had started listening to in Cleveland. There was a modern rock station called The End, and they played that a ton. And so I love that song. So I kind of jumped on there. I got a greatest hits record. And then, over the years, I've kind of, stuck with them, but also gone backwards and gotten all the 80s records and Joy Division. And, I had a Joy Division best of in high school, like everyone does. So, I've kind of jumped around a little bit. And I loved electronic, too. So I definitely had an electronic record as well, because I was a big Smiths fan.
Right. So there's two things that happen now. Even though they put out a huge record, almost immediately you have Peter Hook releasing One True Passion with the band Revenge. That comes out in 1990. And then the following year, 1991, Bernard Sumner releases the first electronic album with Johnny Marr. So on the heels of their most successful record, they don't make another New Order record. Does anybody know the story? Did they just want to take a break from New Order? It seems like these things came out really fast after this New Order record that was released. Obviously, there's another New Order album to come, so they weren't on no speaking terms yet. They weren't suing each other yet. So, does anybody know the history as far as why those two projects happened so quickly?
Well, and I realize actually we should probably back up a little bit, because they also had in 1990 World in Motion, the single. And I feel like that was actually massive in the UK too.
That was a World Cup single, right?
Yeah. And that was even a huge hit here too. And that was a non-album track. That was on, that hit huge on the modern rock tracks, and it was a top 10 dance club, and it was a UK number one too.
Express yourself, create the space, you can win, don't give up the chase, beat the man, take him on. You never give up. It's one-on-one. Express yourself. It's one-on-one. Express yourself. It's one-on-one. Express yourself. You can't be wrong when something's good. It's never gone. Love's got the world in motion, and I know what we can do. Love's got the world in motion, and I can't believe it's true.
And so I feel like potentially, I don't quite know the story, but I feel like after that came out is when everything sort of slid downhill for a couple of years.
Okay. Interesting. I forgot about that single.
Yeah, World Cup singles, big deal over there.
Right, yeah.
And I feel like that song, it was like the theme for that year's World Cup. So, it just, you have an automatic anthem.
Okay.
It's funny, though, because it's like still an anthem. Because I if I'm remembering correctly, I went to Hyde Park to see The Cure last year, and I'm pretty sure Ride came out like to World in Motion. I'm pretty sure, or at some point during that day, because the World Cup was going on, I heard World in Motion. So it's like still this like anthem in the UK.
Wow.
So let's see the first breakup.
Yeah, that's the thing. I tried to find out some information about, like, was there some sort of schism between Hook and Sumner, but it doesn't really indicate that. It just kind of jumps to, well, they put out the single and then they both had side projects. And in listening to those side projects, you can clearly hear there's a difference in the direction that each of them wanted to go. We can start with the electronic album, because that's actually a band that we've touched on as a podcast. We did Twisted Tenderness, the third record, many seasons back, and discussed that. It was, I think Jay and I both were impressed but not overwhelmed by that record. There was some issues we had with it. But I thought in listening to those two albums, the first electronic record and the Revenge record, I could hear the influence on the 93 New Order album, Republic. Did you guys pick up a change in the sound in comparison from Technique to Republic that seemed connected to either of those two?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that there is definitely a shift between that, Technique still very much, even though it's right there on the edge, like, it still very much sounds like an 80s record.
Right.
And then I think that I don't know what it is. I think, Annie mentioned Regret, and that is a song that still really, really holds up to me, and in the strangest way, I mean, maybe you'll disagree, but in the strangest way, it feels very timeless to me. It doesn't specifically sound, I don't recall the 90s immediately when I hear that song, aside from, like, just my obvious nostalgia factor, because I was, like, in high school. And also was just like a huge fan of that song, but I just that song in particular just like really, really holds up to me.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And when I went back and re-listened to Technique, it felt so 1989 to me. Like, it just felt so dated, and I was not expecting that, because it's been a while to listen to it. Like, ooh, wow, it's not very. And I think a lot of New Orders, like Low Life, is also aged extremely well. And I think Low Life has that kind of timeless quality, but Technique feels definitely of its time.
Yeah, I agree. And I wasn't super familiar with, again, I actually have not ever heard the other two side project. And Revenge was something that I think that, honestly, Pineapple Face is the only track I was ever really familiar with. I know that got some radio airplay on Waxy when I was listening there in those early years. But it's certainly nothing I ever ran out and bought. Or maybe was not even explicitly aware that it was a side project.
I'm trying an icy form of love, even though I fight it, I can't hide. With all the feelings in my head and all the timings I have tried. Will anybody give me what I need? Put all my faith in God above. This time I'm falling just for you. I guess I'm hungry for that love.
but electronic, I definitely was, and was a huge fan of that first record.
Like in hindsight, I hear it feels like the electronic record, especially the singles, are very much sort of a bridge to regret. You know, like Johnny Marr like still plays live. He still plays Getting Away with It, and he actually added Get the Message into his set list last year for the first time. And I interviewed him actually a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned how excited I was that was back in there, and he was just like waxing ecstatic about how much he loves that song. But it sounds, in 2018 when I saw them, it totally fit in with the rest of the set. It was very timeless sounding.
Yeah, I think that all 4 singles from the electronic record are just, like, honestly, they're pretty damn perfect. I never spent a ton of time with the entire record, to be honest, but, like, those singles are incredible.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Jay, I don't know if you remember the electronic record that we did that well.
Yeah, I remember the review.
Yeah.
And I know, I know Getting Away with It. I mean, that's just, when I revisited that album for this song, like, that's just a song I just remember very clearly. It's a great hook. So some of this stuff was familiar, and I do remember, we reviewed the third record, 3 seasons ago?
Yeah. It just, in hearing that song again, like you said, it was familiar. I'd heard it somewhere. I don't remember. 1980, I think 89, 90, whenever that single was released. I don't remember what I was listening to station-wise, but because there is a bit more of an organic feel to that record because of Marr playing guitar, there is something that carried over that makes Regret and the Republic album sound a little less mechanical, which is what I was picking up when Annie said, like, the dated sound of 89. Like, that record sounds mechanical because it sounds like it's using whatever synthesizers and drum machines are very 80s sounding, and they're very they can sound very mechanical, whereas there's a real, like, playing to the sound, or it sounds like a band more so on Republic on a lot of that record, that I wonder if is carried over from the electronic sort of vibe. It's also, like, a little bit more laid back, which I feel like that was carried forward forever with New Order. Like, the 4 on the floor stomp that I associate with, like, a lot of the dance stuff is not as prevalent from after Technique as it is before Technique. It's the same thing with a little bit with the Revenge album, which I was not familiar with at all, but it sounds much more like a band. And I don't know if those guys were just tired of whatever they were doing in the studio and they felt the need to, like, play with some more organic sounds, but they both seem to, like, carry over to what was going to be happening in 93 with Republic. And then also you mentioned, Shiv, the Other Two and You, that comes out in 93. Is that around the same time? When does Republic come out? That's in
the spring of 93, yeah.
And then in November is when The Other Two and You comes out, which is odd that, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's not, that they have an album of the other two members coming out the same year. Seems like a lot of material that now in retrospect I'm like, well, maybe Tasty Fish would have been a cool single for Republic if they had reworked that. And it also made me think, why weren't they using Gillian as a vocalist? Because, you know what I mean? Like, there was an opportunity there.
I was not familiar with The Other Two, and when I listened to that, I was like, this is a really strong record. Like, it's just, her, whatever they were doing on that, like, I was like, wow, this should have gotten a lot more attention. And I'm wondering if because, they had Quest and Warner Brothers, promoting, Republic, it was Republic. It was kind of like, yeah, you guys can put this out, but we're not going to, like, give any sort of attention to it.
No matter what you say, no matter what I do, it all comes back to you.
Because I vaguely remember it coming out, but I don't remember anything for it. I'm like, this is actually really decent. This should not have been buried.
Yeah.
Can we talk for a minute about how interesting it is that in the United States that their records were released because of Quincy Jones?
That's right.
Like that, I've always thought that that's fascinating.
So what's the story there?
I don't entirely know, but Quest was his imprint of Warner.
Okay.
And, you know, all of the... I mean, I think that all of their U.S. releases, up through a certain point, you know, everything was, you know, basically through Quest.
Huh. I had not realized that. Yeah, it was...
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's actually pretty fascinating because, I mean, obviously they were, you know, with those early singles, like they had these huge club hits and everything, but that's, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't really know how many other artists were ever signed to that label. I mean, I don't think that he put out a ton of releases through it. And New Order was always there.
And Joy Division. It says, according to Wikipedia, it says that Joy Division was distributed through Quest.
I mean, there were definitely reissues and stuff. Like, maybe he was there from the beginning on that. I guess I don't know.
That makes me wonder if he's listening to Unknown Pleasures and he's like, yeah, this is gonna fit well with our George Benson record.
I mean, it's an odd pairing, and I'm guessing that the promotion for New Order stuff generally went through Warner Brothers staff anyway. But like, I do sort of love that idea of people working in an office for Quincy Jones who had to promote New Order.
On Wikipedia, now they're quoting that Quincy Jones apparently told NME in May 1990, "I'm so honored that New Order picked my label to go on in the U.S. It really flattered me. They're beautiful people."
Okay.
But they picked his label. So, you know, how did they even get to that point? I don't know. I should have read like Peter Hook's. I read his second book or third book. And I might have glossed over this part. I should have like found it, but his book's like 600 pages. It's incredible. But like, it's just, yes, I think that's his, yeah, that's right. His New Order book. And he was, I think he told me it was like twice that, the first draft or something. So I think somewhere in there buried, I'm sure it's there. And someone will probably have read this and know the answer, I'm guessing.
I can't wait to find out.
Yeah.
All right. So of the initial side project releases, you've got The Other Two and You, the first electronic album, and Revenge. What's your pick out of those? Is electronic the clear winner of the side projects?
Yeah.
I think that's the clear winner. Yeah, and especially because let's not forget. I've always thought it was very interesting, actually, it being Bernard with Johnny Marr, because musically, it certainly has more in line with New Order music than with the Smiths. But then you also had, at least in the writing department on some of those songs, the Pet Shop Boys for the first record.
Right. Neil Tennant's on that, right?
Yeah. And those, you know, I think that especially for Getting Away With It, I think is a big part of the incredible melody of that song.
You know, now that you mention it, now that I'm hearing that in my head, I'm like, that is kind of a Pet Shop Boys melody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, he definitely is like the secret sauce of that track, in my opinion.
No, I agree totally.
Interesting. So then the band did put out one official record in the 90s, which is Republic, and some folks over at our Patreon page, they had some thoughts about this. Darren Leach said Republic had 4 great singles off it and the rest were filler in my opinion. For me, this album was a massive disappointment after The Amazing Technique, which is my favorite. Get Ready is a step up in 2001. And then, let's see, what else was there? Jim Lazowski says, I cannot say enough good things about their song Regret, which is easily one of my favorite songs of the entire decade. Republic was a pretty decent record if memory serves, but didn't compare to their earlier work. Regret was one of the first covers I ever learned, and instantly made me a fan of the band. Mike Bond, Regret was something of a classic, although the album felt a touch forgettable. I still remember buying my copy of Electronics' Get the Message on 7-inch, which is still probably in my collection, after hearing it on the Mark Goodyear BBC Radio 1 show. Get the Message was another great single, and I remember buying the debut Electronic album on tape at my local Woolworths. He said, while the Pet Shop Boys connection was a touch dubious in my taste, the collaboration resulted in something truly special.
He followed up with, World in Motion, though, was something truly awful.
Well,
not a fan of that song.
No, not a fan of that song. But Ian Wobble, he went on the other. He said, sad time for one of the greatest bands of all time. Republic introduces the New Order by the Number sound, no longer pushing boundaries. Peter Hook has always said that Bernard came in and changed the whole sound of the album after his time with Electronic, which may explain the similarities between a Republic and the first Electronic album. I would love to hear the original mix. Interesting. Maybe that's in the book about Bernard messing with the mix. He said the album has some stone cold New Order classics, but I find it way overproduced. But maybe it was just a 90s thing for them. Regret is one of the finest pop songs ever written, period. And that's the thing. I think in terms of their catalog, I mean, Regret is up there with probably the finest singles that they have. It's just that the album overall seems pretty divisive in terms of its quality. Some are saying there's 4 good tracks off of it. Some are saying that the rest of the album is junk. I found it to be listenable. I didn't find it to be an unlistenable record. It's not as... There's nothing else that stands up to Regret as far as a hook. Does anybody else feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing about this record is that it's super front loaded. I mean, literally, I mean, I bought the vinyl when they reissued it a few years back, and, you know, all the singles are in a row on side A, and then there's a 5th song, and then, you know, side B, I can't say that I'm flipping over and listening to as much, but those first, you know, the first side and all of those singles, I think, are pretty great. I mean, it is interesting to note that the single World off of the Republic album is not to be confused with World in Motion, the World Cup single. That is a totally separate song. On this album, it was World, parentheses, The Price of Love. And I would dare say nearly as catchy of a track as Regret. I really always liked that.
So I'm stepping out of time because breaking is a crime, and it may all be too late, but I've no passion for this hate. That's the price of love. Can you feel it? If we could buy it now, how long will it last?
But it's kind of funny to me, you know, if it tells you where my head was at. I mean, I very specifically remember going to what was then Gym City Records in Dayton, Ohio, and I guess I would have been a junior or senior in high school when Regret came out, and on the same afternoon I bought the 12-inch for Regret and the 12-inch for Janet Jackson, That's the Way Love Goes.
Nice.
Solid picks.
I was going to say, that's a good trip.
It was a great trip. And I mean, and it really, it's funny. I looked up because I was thinking, about how big of a song Regret was, and it according to the Billboard charts, I mean, it went to number 7 on the mainstream top 40. Number 7. That's pretty shocking.
Yeah. And they followed
it up.
Of
course, I mean, it was number 1 at alternative radio first,
right,
and then crossed over.
And then they followed this up by breaking up.
Yeah, well,
you know, as all bands, do when they're scoring hit singles and whatnot. Yeah, they broke up. That's when the other two's debut album was released later in that year. And then they followed it up with what you do when you break up. You put out your best of. The Best of New Order came out in '94.
I don't know. I have thoughts about that. I really hate this record.
Really?
The remix. I do. I got this remix record. I think the remixes on this, the remixes on there put me so off on the band. It took me probably until Get Ready to get back into liking the band.
I take
that back.
They did have Arthur Baker do different versions. Okay.
Well, some of them were previously unreleased. It was like Bizarre Love Triangle 94 and True Faith 94. And that's the stuff that it just did not work for me. For whatever reason, I was I don't know, 16 or something. I had a really visceral negative reaction to that.
Was it Full House negative or?
It was pretty negative. I basically just didn't listen to the CD. I probably grumbled to myself. Yeah, I don't think I wrote about it on my GeoCities page, but I did have a GeoCities page. But yeah, there was something about it, for whatever reason, that it just did, the remixes just did not sit right with me. Probably because I had heard the originals and I really liked them, and so I was kind of like, what is this? It just
right.
Ugh.
See, I don't think that I even bought that best of because I already had Substance and didn't care. But was the parallel release, the rest of New Order, which was all the best remixes off the 12-inch singles, and it was amazing to have all of those collected onto vinyl or onto CD.
I should have spent my money on that rather than the other one. But I think it was I think it might have even been a Columbia House pickup or BMG Music Club.
Oh, yeah.
In retrospect,
I was very disappointed.
It is weird that they would mess with. They're putting out a best of, but then they're changing the songs. I understand when bands do that, and they'll have one that's the live version of the song instead of the studio version or what have you, or they'll throw a new track on there that is supposed to be a hit, and but to redo a bunch of the tracks and that's not have the original versions is weird.
I would say though it was not that unusual in that moment of time. I mean, you had things like Madonna's Immaculate Collection. Several of the biggest hits on that appear in remix versions that were not on any other, that had never been released before. And to me, those are the definitive versions now. But
yeah, no, very true.
It's actually very Kiss-like.
And you have to. Sorry, but also just remember, they had already done the Blue Monday '88, where they had, I mean, it's just they were actually really good at milking things, and I mean, I don't think that those versions had much play in the United States. But that's definitely the kind of thing that they would do and get on the radio all over again overseas.
Gotcha. I guess I'm not thinking about enough of the other markets that are probably.
Oh yeah, I mean the U.S. was not their biggest market. I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm looking. True Faith 94 hit number 9 in the UK, and Blue Monday 95 hit 17.
Yeah.
But I mean, Blue Monday. I mean, that was the third time it had hit the charts in the UK. It also charted in 83 and 88.
And, of course, would then inspire Orgy to cover it and turn it into another hit single.
Let's not even bring that up, Tim.
It was in the 90s, unfortunately.
Yes, it was.
And you know what I can say just from looking around here is that, essentially the best of New Order was kind of just done to cash in for the holiday season in the UK at the end of that year.
Yeah.
It didn't come out in the US till the following spring, but it was out overseas in the fall of 94, so they were basically just like, oh, here, Christmas gifts.
Yeah, there you go. 17.99. Pick this up. It's all songs that they already had. Yeah, I'm looking.
But
there are a
they
lot of
did it.
compilations.
Yeah, that's how I first got to know them. I obviously, knew the big hits from listening to the radio, but, I started out just by buying Substance. That was all I thought I needed as a teenager, It took a long time for me to go back to the full albums.
So then, in addition to this, we also get, in July of this year, the Raise the Pressure album, the second album from Electronic, which I did not recognize anything off of that record when I heard it, unlike with the first album. Were either of you familiar with that record? I was not.
Raise the Pressure?
Yeah.
Again, my knowledge in that time comes strictly from Waxy. And so I know two of the singles from that record. Forbidden City, and I actually don't even recall the second one. But those definitely got played at the station and were in the library. So I knew those tracks, but I definitely never owned that album.
This album felt a little Britpoppy to me. Like, it's a little jangly at times, and I don't know, it had like more of an organic kind of poppy feel to it. Not as synthetic as the first electronic record.
Yeah, I could hear that too. It's interesting that it sounds more organic, and yet they brought in the guy from Kraftwerk on this record.
Yeah.
Karl Bartos, which you would think they would go more electronic, but they didn't.
Just a lot of jangly guitars on it.
Which I guess that makes sense because Johnny Marr's guitar playing can get pretty jangly.
Yeah, which is, I think, what we when we reviewed the third record, that was one of the things I think we were both a little surprised by, is that the lack of jangly guitar on that. It's more electronic than what we expected. At least I expected.
Right.
I think the second record is kind of what I expected when we went into the third one, of kind of what they would sound like, having not really heard the band.
Yeah. Annie, were you familiar at all with that record?
I wasn't. Like, I was probably vaguely aware that it came out just from reading music magazines, but like I didn't remember a thing on it, weirdly enough. I own it even, I believe, and I don't know if I've actually even ever like listened to it. I think I picked up a copy along the way because it was cheap. But like, yeah, I had never felt really compelled to listen to it. I can't tell you why. I have no idea why.
Around this time, so Revenge is a one and done for, well, not one and done. It gets re-released as their one album gets re-released in 2004 with some bonus material. Peter Hook then goes and he tours with Durutti Column. Is that how you say the name? Mm-hmm. And then starts working on Monaco, which comes out a couple years later. That's Music for Pleasure. I think, is it the same singer? Is it David Potts who's the singer in both bands?
Mm-hmm.
So I liked the Monaco stuff way better than the Revenge stuff. And actually that single...
Oh, What Do You Want From Me is just a classic track.
Yeah.
Like, I knew that, and I didn't know I knew it. We must have played it at FAL. I'm
got that.
It probably was in there, because it definitely was a song that I loved from Waxy. So if we had it in the studio, I'm sure I had it marked up.
So...
And it's got that signature Peter Hook bass.
Yes.
Like, yeah, that's what I want. I want a whole record of that.
Well, because he's such a unique bass player that when you hear it, you immediately go, yes, this is awesome.
There is one thing that I would die for. It's when you say my life is in your hands. 'Cause when you're near me, your love is taking my life away, ruining everything. What do you want from me? It's not how it used to be. You're taking my life away, ruining everything. Give me something.
So Ian Wobble, in addition to his Republic comments, also said his Monaco project produced one of the greatest singles New Order never released, with "What Do You Want From Me," but the album is very unforgettable. Or is he meaning to say forgettable? He said, "I never bothered with the second album. The side projects show the band really struggling with identity, and most failed without big help, aka Marr and Tennant, or on the electronic album. A lot of tension and fighting did not help the band in the early 90s, helped along with the closure of Factory Records, but it does go to show how well a band can work together, and it proves with the release of Get Ready in 2001. Johnny Hooper said, New Order was my gateway into so-called alternative music, although my music tastes have changed quite dramatically since. I'm indebted to their music for showing me the way forward. Though you could be forgiven for thinking that their music might have been only for its time, it's proven to be timeless in its capacity to influence and captivate, much like their previous incarnation, I might add." Yeah, it got me wondering, like, well, what if the "What Do You Want From Me" had been a New Order single? Like, would Bernard Sumner have pulled that off the same way? But that bass line is like, would have been perfect for a New Order song.
I think that's why it had the success that it did. I mean, keep in mind, when the Monaco record came out, that was still before alternative radio was completely ruined, and "What Do You Want From Me" got a lot of play,
Totally.
on alt stations, and I mean, I think it was. I mean, it's kind of totally forgotten now, but I think that it was a really big radio hit at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I was still in high school then, and I think it got airplay here. I love that song. I think that song was just, it was an interesting kind of bridge too, I think, from Britpop to kind of where British guitar music was going too. Because I remember it getting airplay. There was a really good Britpop show in Boston that I used to listen to, and like they got an airplay there too, I believe. And it just like really fit in well with everything going on in the late 90s too in Britain. So it was really, and you know, it was Peter Hook, so it was a pretty good mix of even his early stuff and where he was also going with New Order.
What did you guys think of the album overall, if you had a chance to revisit? Was it just driven by the one song, or did you feel like that was deep, that there were actually other tracks worth revisiting?
I don't know that I think that record is especially deep, but I do think that song, like, you know, definitely stands the test of time for me.
Yeah,
I'd agree with that.
So we mentioned that eventually they do get back together, and that's 98. They reformed to play the Reading Festival, and that sort of brings the band back together on, I guess, speaking terms for the time being. And they hadn't been together for about 5 years, so they still had stuff to work out, you know, individually. So there's another electronic album that comes out. That's the one we reviewed, Twisted Tenderness. And what Jay mentioned, that album seems to me like sort of out of step with 99. I know that they did it with a couple of the guys from Doves, and in knowing that, it seems like it should have been, I don't know, the single Livid is really good, but it's not indicative of the overall record in a lot of ways. And I know Jay and I struggle with the lack of Johnny Marr on that record. Unfortunately, it's not streaming, so it's not streaming in the U.S. I'm sure it's probably streaming in other countries based on the ridiculous rules on what gets to stream where. Yeah, it seems like in terms of the progression of that band, that it makes more sense to be like the second record rather than the third. But I don't remember at all when it came out. Probably because it wasn't. I'm guessing because it was on. What was it? What was the name of that label that it came out on?
It came out on Koch through the United States, and it was it was a long time after the British release. I mean, we played it as an import at Waxy. That was right around the time that I had that was my first full year of working at the station in '99, and
Yeah.
we played it on import. Because that was before Doves were Doves. I mean, Jimmy had been in another band, which a Sub. So like that's how I think how they got to that project was Sub were kind of making house music actually, and that was very, very different than what Doves turned out to be. And yeah, I mean, Arthur Baker worked on that record, and it definitely had some good tracks. I mean, I remember really liking Make It Happen a lot.
Did you like the Steve Winwood cover or the Traffic cover?
That seems like this was a bad idea.
I want to know who pitched that. Who pitched Let's Do Some Traffic? I can't imagine that Bernard Sumner is a big Traffic fan. Maybe he is.
No, you know what? I would actually not be surprised if it's Johnny, because so he and Matt Johnson from the just did Summer in the City, like the old 60s song, which I would never
The Love and Spoonful?
suspected. Yes, they did it live. Not to get too far afield, but basically, the toured the U.S. last year when Johnny was also touring, and they never got together. But Johnny did end up on stage with him, I think, in one of the UK shows. And I was like, they did that song? Really? I would never have suspected that.
I feel like
So
people get together and do those kinds of songs because they're like really simple songs and they know the chord progression. They're like, it's just G, C, and D. It's just like 50 other songs. So we can pull it off and everybody knows the melody and the audience can kind of sing along. Like, let's do Louie Louie. You know what I mean? It's probably, I'm probably wrong, but I feel like there's like guitar players, you can just throw like 3 chords at them and they'll be able to strum those chords, even if they just step on stage without knowing the song. I don't know, that Traffic cover just throws me for that record. Jay, do you remember that for this record?
I don't know. And you can't even, I mean, it's not even available. How do we even review this? Because I don't have the MP3s and it's not on streaming.
There's ways to get MP3s.
Was this one of the ones we had to listen to on YouTube?
Maybe.
I think it was. Yeah.
It might have been. Also, if you type in a band name and a title and then like ZIP or RAR afterwards.
What? Stop it.
Just saying, that's one of the tricks of the trade.
No one does that.
When you're doing it the wrong way. The right way is to buy the record from the artist if they release it. This actually got released a full year later it was released April 99 in the UK, and then it came out in 2000 in its original version that was released again in 2001, Twisted Tenderness Deluxe, with a whole second disc of extra songs and remixes.
Well, I think that's essentially what we got in the U.S. Like, because it was so delayed for the United States, Koch released it as a 2 CD version, and it had a lot of that extra stuff on it. I think that was just the regular edition for the United States, as I recall. I might be wrong on that.
And then, also in '99, we get the other two album, which is Super Highways. Couple of singles were released. I don't recall any of this. You Can Fly and Super Highways, the song where the title track were the singles. I did not check those out. I'm going to be honest.
I have to say, I am really, 'cause I just don't remember anything about this project, and I am flabbergasted that they did have U.S. releases, or at least the first one did, through Quest. I've never seen the cover art. That's just completely off my radar, and I feel like I pay more attention than most to these things.
I was going to say, if it's not on your radar.
Intriguing.
I feel exactly the same way. I'm kind of like, how did I not hear really about this? Like, it didn't ring a bell. And I mean, I was pretty much immersed in music 24/7. And you were at the radio station then. Yeah, I have no idea.
to be fair, Jay and I have looked at like release dates in the 90s, and when you get into the latter half of the 90s, there are so many albums coming out every week by bands that you know, like 20, 30 albums a week, and you're like, oh, I know that band, yeah, I got that album, oh yeah, that it probably slipped on. I don't think that there's a US release for this album.
I don't think so either. Like looking this up.
Yeah, the
Maybe
second record. Yeah, I think the second record did not, which makes sense why I guess it was not on my radar.
So the band gets back together, and they make a new album. 2001, Get Ready is released. Jay, this is where you get into the picture, right? This is where you're like, I'm on board finally with New Order.
I'm like, hey, I get this.
Hey, what's this band? I'm gonna check them out. I've heard good things.
A little bit. I mean, honestly, it wasn't until Waiting for the Sirens Call that I really like.
You
really
finally warmed up.
Yeah.
It took 20 years, but I'm
so
finally
when
warmed
you get to did this band survive the 90s? For me, you already know what my answer is going to be. Spoiler.
In listening to this record, and I didn't really hear any traces of what I heard on Technique, other than Bernard Sumner's voice. A lot of this record feels influenced by what they did individually in the 2000s, and then just going into a very different direction altogether. And maybe that's, intentional, that they were trying to push away from that, but it does not feel like there's much of a connection for me to what they sounded like in their 80s era. So what did you guys think of this record? Let me ask you this. Did you get it when it came out? And did you enjoy it when it came out? Do you remember it all? And revisiting it, does it still hold up for you, or does it not hold up? Or how does it sound? Shiv, I'll start with you.
I loved this record when it came out. I mean, at this point, when this album came out, I was a music director at WOXY. And I really specifically remember, it's kind of funny. We had such a weird relationship with major labels because we didn't really play their games. And we played a lot of stuff on imports, and, they would get frustrated with us, especially as the overall format of quote-unquote alternative radio moved to basically aggro rock. And we weren't helping them on the charts. So I remember very clearly when our Warner local rep, because back in those days, I doubt that's still as much of a thing, but we used to have a regional Warner Brothers representative who covered like Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, whatever, and he came to the station with a giant boombox and played us Crystal for the first time at one of our music meetings. And we just loved it so much. I mean, like that is a track that we put on the air. And I mean, at that point in time, I have to imagine we're one of the few commercial radio stations in the country that, put that shit into heavy rotation right away and wrote it for a very long time. But that was, for us, it was like a classic band from our station's history putting out a great new record. So it was like such a perfect fit. And I mean, I'm looking at the track listing. I mean, we played 1, 2, 3, 4. We played at least 5. So we played half this record. We played 5 of the 10 tracks off this album. And I think that by and large, it still really holds up for me. Again, it's one of those albums that's kind of front loaded. I think the first half is stronger than the second half. But yeah, I mean, I even love when you get into the deeper cuts. Like we played Rock the Shack because it had Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream on it, and it was just one of those songs that sounded like our station. I mean, I really love this record.
Annie, what about you on Get Ready?
Yeah, when I heard it at the time, and I was writing about music at that point, and I'm pretty sure I still somewhere have like a promo of that record. So like with like the Warner Brothers like CDR or whatever that is. I'm gonna have to go digging for that because I also loved it. Like I thought, like what Shiv said about Crystal. Crystal is just a massive single. You know, I mean, I love that it sounded different than everything going on at that time. It was kind of a breath of fresh air, but it was just like, it just kind of boomed out of the speakers. But I also was just like, wow, like I had really liked, they had a song on the Beach soundtrack called Brutal. And I think it was actually a new song. Like I was, you know, at college, so I had high-speed internet. So, and I was a big Napster fan. So I like distinctly remember downloading Brutal and being like, all right, you know, I totally was into it. And so it really got me back on kind of the New Order train. And then this came out and it was just like, oh my God. Yeah, the Rock the Shack with Bobby Gillespie is just a fantastic record, or single too. And 60 Miles an Hour, like it was just everything. And it's funny, like in hindsight, listening to this record, that it really predicted a lot of the stuff that was coming on in the rest of the decade, with all the post-punk coming back and, you know, LCD Sound System. Like it was actually a very forward-thinking album in hindsight.
I've been accused of everything from Timbuktu to Old Berlin. I need some armor for my flesh. I need to stop and take a rest. I've been wide-eyed but couldn't see. I stand accused of being me. I believe in politics. I believe in everything. I believe this world of ours is giving me adrenaline. When I hear a baby cry, when I see an old man die, that's just the way it is. Rock the shack, rock the shack, rock the shack, rock the shack. Rock the shack, rock the shack, rock the shack, rock the shack. Yeah, that's the way it is.
I don't know if this, if you got this as a press person, Annie, I would have imagined, but the way that they set this record up was that even though there are like 3,000 compilations for New Order, the first thing that they did for this record was create a promo-only compilation called 20 Years of New Order. And so they sent that out to radio and I imagine journalists and stuff, and just was like, you know, laid down a refresher, as if to say, you know, like, this band, you know, this is their history, this is important, this is why you need to pay attention to this record. And I just remember we did tons of promotions, like giving away those compilations. And then I think the other thing for me at the time was, and they were always great at remixes, but, you know, this record came out and whoever was A&Ring all the mixes, like, they were getting all of, like, the hottest producers and remixers at that time to do the mixes. So, you know, you had, you know, like John Digweed and stuff, you know, people like that, like doing the mixes of the singles, and they were huge on the dance club charts at that time as well.
I remember that because I think I have it somewhere. I think I have like a CD that's like just the Crystal remixes. There were so many remixes of Crystal, and I think I rescued it from a dollar bin. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean those John Digweed mixes are like 10+ minutes long.
Oh yeah,
like, they're just
totally.
they're just massive.
Yeah, I guess that's an aspect of this band which separates them from a lot of the other bands that we discuss, is that the dance charts, we don't necessarily ever have discussions about that. We're usually dealing with the modern rock charts and the album charts and stuff, and then also the number of the way that the remix singles can impact the popularity of the band is quite different, because they had, you mentioned Crystal. There are 52 different versions of a Crystal single that are listed on Discogs.
Well,
Wow.
you have to realize that even in that moment where CD singles were kind of on the way out at that point, but you still that's one thing that Warner was always really good at and very cognizant of, was artists who had just a big history and a very solid fan base. They made sure to release all of the things that were coming out internationally, or at least, generally speaking, they would release them still as CD and 12-inch singles for the US market. Now, I can't imagine that there were tons of copies pressed of some of that stuff, but they were doing commercial 12 inches for the singles off of that record, because they knew that there were people who would collect them.
And then there was, around this time... Oh, okay. It came from there was a single called "Here to Stay," which came from the 24-Hour Party People soundtrack. It was around the same time as
that song is so good.
Yeah, as the Get Ready album. So I thought for a second it was on there, but it was not.
No, that was from 2002. That track was done with the Chemical Brothers, and it's an absolute fucking banger.
That entire soundtrack, like, unsurprisingly, was amazing. I love the movie anyway, but yeah, that soundtrack, totally fucking awesome.
Annie, good to know that 24-Hour Party People is getting its first U.S. Blu-ray release coming up here soon.
Is it really? I did not
Yes.
know that. That is excellent news, actually.
So this is the point in the show. Now that we have run the decade, we've hit the album before, the album after, everything in between, well, we have to decide whether the band survived the 90s. And in this case, maybe not being a band helped them survive the 90s. Now, in full disclosure, this is the last record, Get Ready is the last record with the original lineup of the band.
Yes.
Gillian would leave after this record. Phil Cunningham, is that his name, comes in as a member of the band. He was on Get Ready, but then he becomes a full-time member on Waiting for the Sirens Call. And then that's Waiting for the Sirens Call is the last album with Peter Hook, who leaves the band. And then there's a lawsuit between Peter Hook and New Order, I think with regards to royalties, and it's just a big ugly mess. It turns into like an 80s metal band at that point, where people are suing each other and you've got Dokken going on or something like that. So what we need to figure out is, did this band survive the 90s, or did the 90s consume them? Jay, I feel like you have a strong opinion about this.
Well, I think when we talk about this with other bands, we're talking about like the business, the trends, the culture change. Like most of the bands we've covered, that has had a significant impact on them.
Right.
I don't know as much about the band as you guys do, but I don't get the sense that like the trends of the 90s had anything to do with their dysfunction. And I think 2005, they put out a really good record. So that's, 5 years after the decade ends, they're still making good music. I don't know that anything that ended up happening with the band and why they're not together now had anything to do with, the 90s in general, as with some other bands that we've talked about.
Right, exactly. So,
I mean, I certainly think it's unfortunate that they've had the falling apart that they've had, because, I always think it's weird. I don't know about... I live in my little Austin, Texas bubble. Peter Hook plays here all the goddamn time. And he comes here and plays New Order songs. Like, I think it's weird. But, in terms of did they survive the 90s, I think that they Get Ready sort of proves how they did survive and took everything, all of the sort of splintering off that happened, I think helped really inform what they were going to become and how Get Ready was really shaped. And I think it's successful. I really do.
Annie, what about you?
I would agree with that. And, I think what's interesting is that they were sort of ahead of the curve on the whole, like, the best career move you can do is break up, because then everyone is so excited when you're back. Because,
that's right.
Yeah, I mean, it was, they got back together in 98. And it was kind of a slow build back up. I mean, I remember like, a ton of goodwill in the first half of the 2000s with them. And so I think, that's definitely something that you can't really overlook. I think, and it's funny because Peter Hook has not played in Cleveland, and I'm very upset about that. Because you're right, he's been touring all the time. I interviewed him. He's in a great place right now, but like has not come to Cleveland. And I think he would do pretty well in Cleveland, but I digress. But but yeah, I mean, but New Order played here, and I was kind of like last year, and I'm like, I honestly didn't feel compelled to go. I was just like, and I've never seen them. And I do think it is unfortunate how the schism happened. But I think from just reading Peter's book, it sounds like there's just even when the 90s they were apart, and even when back together, there's just so much dysfunction in the band that it just seemed like it was sort of inevitable. And it's sad. I mean, it's different personalities. But I do think they came out of the 90s, on a high note, which is better than I think a lot of bands can say. And they survived actually the 90s, and, in a way that a lot of sort of, 80s alternative acts didn't.
All right. There we have it. New Order survived the 90s. This was an interesting run. We've never had a band that had such a wild decade in terms of splitting up and doing so many different things and ultimately coming back together and making strong records. We've done Van Halen, Metallica, Duran Duran, Tom Petty, just off the top of my head. Those are in the 90s that we've done. Jay, am I forgetting any other ones that we've done for in the 90s?
I think that's it.
And they all had their individual issues with regards to what happened in the 90s, and some survived, some didn't. And this is an interesting one. So we need to thank our patrons, first of all, for suggesting this. This was a cool episode to do. Spend some time with New Order. And we also need to thank our guests for joining us. It took a little bit to get it all together, but we made it happen. It was a fun episode. Thank you, Annie, for coming on. What do you got going on?
Oh, Lord. The $10,000 question. That's a really good question. I have an interview with Ian Hunter I did that is probably going to go up this week.
Cool.
Very cool.
And Shiv, what's up with you? Anything you want to share?
I just survived South by Southwest,
right?
Which was always a great time. And then, I think, as you may know at this point, I don't do as much music stuff anymore. I am pretty embedded in the film world here in Austin. I do have a weekly column in the Austin American Statesman every Wednesday that tips you off to what's new on VOD and streaming services like Netflix. So you can find that online at statesman.com. And then I'm just always, kind of running around here in town watching live music and seeing a lot of movies.
Excellent. Thank you both for joining us. This was a lot of fun. I want to remind everybody, patreon.com/digmeout is where you go to join the conversation. You can vote in our polls, get merch, and all that kind of stuff. And then if you like what you heard, please consider leaving us some positive feedback over at iTunes. So for Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.
Thanks for listening. To support the podcast, visit www.patreon.com/digmeout and become a monthly subscriber at www.digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, as well as our merchandise store at Zazzle.com.